NewsRadio opens with WNYX in a rare state of uneasy calm that immediately feels suspicious to everyone who works there, because nothing good ever happens when the newsroom is quiet for too long. And Dave Nelson is the first to notice that Jimmy James has unexpectedly taken a deep interest in employee wellness, announcing a new initiative that involves bringing in a professional consultant to evaluate stress levels, workplace satisfaction, and overall mental health across the station. A concept that sounds harmless on paper but instantly triggers chaos because nobody at WNYX trusts the idea of being analyzed for psychological stability in a place that thrives on dysfunction. Lisa Miller initially sees the program as a potentially positive step toward improving work conditions and reducing burnout. But she quickly realizes that the presence of an outside evaluator changes how everyone behaves in subtle but destructive ways. As people begin performing versions of themselves that they think will appear healthy rather than honest, Joe Garelli immediately rejects the entire premise and refuses to participate in any of the assessments, arguing that measuring emotional stability in a workplace like theirs is fundamentally meaningless. Bill McNeil becomes fascinated with the idea of being diagnosed and starts exaggerating his personality traits in both directions, alternating between claiming he is the most stable person in the building and hinting at deeply hidden psychological turmoil. Catherine Duke treats the evaluation as performance art and deliberately shifts her behavior depending on who is watching her, making it impossible to tell what is authentic and what is staged, and Matthew is overwhelmed by the questionnaire and interviews, answering everything too honestly in a way that makes him appear far more unstable than he actually is. The consultant arrives with a calm, clinical demeanor that immediately unsettles the team because her observations are precise, quiet, and unintentionally revealing. And she begins conducting one-on-one sessions that quickly expose the underlying tensions within the station, not through dramatic revelations, but through small comments that land uncomfortably close to the truth, such as pointing out Dave's need for control masking insecurity, Lisa's perfectionism masking anxiety, Joe's detachment masking distrust of authority, Bill's humor masking fear of irrelevance, Catherine's performance masking uncertainty about identity, and Matthew's eagerness masking a deep need for acceptance. As these evaluations continue, the station slowly fractures into self-aware performances of mental health, with everyone trying to correct or exaggerate their traits based on what they think the consultant wants to see, leading to increasingly unnatural interactions where authenticity collapses under observation. And Dave becomes especially fixated on how the consultant perceives him as a leader, prompting him to micromanage not just work tasks but emotional expression, encouraging open communication in a way that ironically shuts down real honesty. Lisa pushes back against this artificial environment, arguing that the consultant's presence is distorting behavior rather than revealing truth, while Joe quietly begins sabotaging the process by refusing to engage in standardized responses, forcing the consultant to deal with genuine silence instead of curated answers. Bill escalates into increasingly dramatic self-assessments that confuse the evaluation process entirely. Catherine deliberately blurs every category by switching emotional modes mid-conversation, and Matthew becomes so anxious about giving the wrong answer that he starts mirroring whatever he thinks the consultant expects, making his responses completely unreliable. The turning point of the episode comes when the consultant presents preliminary findings that classify the entire station as high-functioning but emotionally inconsistent, a label that Dave initially interprets as a failure, but Lisa reframes as an accurate description of a creative, chaotic environment that cannot be neatly categorized, leading to a philosophical divide between wanting structure and accepting instability. Jimmy James, meanwhile, views the entire process as an entertaining experiment in human adaptability and reveals that he never intended the evaluation to produce actionable results, only reflection. A revelation that frustrates Dave, but also forces him to confront the fact that he has been treating emotional complexity like a management problem that can be solved rather than an ongoing condition that must be navigated as pressure builds. The staff eventually breaks from the consultant's framework entirely during a group session where contradictions pile up too quickly to sustain any coherent analysis, with Bill contradicting his own statements, Catherine slipping between personas, Joe refusing categorization outright, Matthew spiraling into confusion before finally admitting he doesn't know how to answer anything anymore, and Lisa openly criticizing the process as fundamentally flawed, which unexpectedly leads to a moment of collective honesty where the group stops performing stability and simply behaves naturally, resulting in chaos, but also genuine interaction that the consultant quietly notes as the most authentic data she has seen all day. Dave, observing this breakdown, finally realizes that the act of being evaluated is itself what distorts behavior, and that WNYX cannot function under constant external measurement without losing what makes it effective, leading him to confront the consultant and argue that the station's value lies precisely in its unpredictability and emotional inconsistency, not in spite of it, and this moment reframes the entire episode from a critique of the staff to a critique of the evaluation process itself. In the aftermath, the consultant's final report is deliberately ambiguous, acknowledging dysfunction, but also highlighting unusual resilience and creativity, leaving Dave frustrated but slightly reassured, Lisa cautiously optimistic, Joe entirely indifferent but satisfied that the system failed to categorize him properly, Bill convinced he won a psychological battle, Catherine amused by the entire spectacle, and Matthew relieved that he does not need to understand any of it to still belong there. The episode closes with the station returning to its normal rhythm, but with a lingering awareness that observation changes behavior and that any attempt to impose psychological order on WNYX will always collapse under the weight of its own artificiality, reinforcing the show's recurring theme that human workplaces are not systems to be optimized but ecosystems to be lived in. And that meaning at WNYX is not found in evaluation or definition, but in the messy, contradictory interactions that continue whether or not anyone is watching. And as the consultant finally leaves WNYX, the episode doesn't really end so much as it decompresses, like the whole station exhaling after being held underwater by constant self-awareness. Because the immediate absence of observation creates an almost physical shift in the room where people stop performing versions of themselves and slowly drift back into their default chaos. But nothing snaps back perfectly, because even after the evaluation ends, the characters are still carrying fragments of how they were seen, and that's where the episode quietly deepens instead of just wrapping things up. Dave Nelson is the first to notice this residue, because even though he tried to reject the idea of being measured, he still can't fully shake the consultant's language about leadership and control, so he starts watching himself more than usual, catching moments where he almost slips back into micromanaging behavior and stopping mid-action, which makes him unusually quiet and slightly off balance compared to his normal reactive leadership style, and Lisa notices this immediately, pushing him to acknowledge that the problem wasn't the evaluation itself, but the way it forced everyone to think of themselves as fixable, which leads to a short but important exchange where Dave admits that he doesn't actually want the station to become more standardized if it means losing what makes it function in the first place, even if that means accepting a level of dysfunction he doesn't always understand. Lisa, meanwhile, is dealing with her own version of post-evaluation reflection because while she performed well in the consultant's framework, she realizes that she doesn't actually want to live inside that framework permanently and that her sense of competence depends on adaptability, not rigid self-optimization. So she quietly shifts back into her more natural role of stabilizing chaos rather than eliminating it. Joe, unsurprisingly, treats the aftermath like proof that the entire system of psychological evaluation is meaningless. But there's a subtle change in how he interacts with the team afterward, because he stops completely resisting participation and instead picks and chooses when to engage. Almost like he's reclaimed control over his own boundaries rather than just rejecting authority outright, which is a small but meaningful evolution for him, even if he would never label it that way. Bill, still processing the idea that he was analyzed, oscillates between mocking the entire experience and secretly believing that the consultant saw something profound in him. So he begins reframing his own behavior as either misunderstood genius or deliberate performance, depending on the audience. And that dual interpretation keeps him in his usual self-mythologizing loop, but with slightly more self-awareness than before. Catherine continues her post-evaluation experimentation by blurring even further the line between sincerity and performance, occasionally referencing the consultant's observations in a way that feels like she's testing whether identity can be reshaped based on external interpretation. And she seems both amused and slightly intrigued by how easily people can be read in one context and completely misunderstood in another. Matthew, who came out of the evaluation looking the most unstable on paper, actually shows the most visible improvement in confidence, because being labeled and then essentially dismissed as fine in context gives him a strange sense of permission to stop overcorrecting his behavior, so he becomes a little less frantic, a little more present, even if he still second-guesses himself constantly. Jimmy James returns in the background of the final act with his usual detached fascination, casually suggesting that the consultant didn't really evaluate the staff so much as reveal how quickly people adapt when they believe they are being measured, which reframes the entire episode in a way that frustrates Dave, but also sticks with him, because it implies that identity at WNYX is always partially reactive rather than fixed. And as the final scenes settle into the familiar rhythm of the newsroom phones ringing, arguments restarting, jokes cutting through tension, the episode lands on its real conclusion, which is that nothing at WNYX is ever actually resolved. It just changes form. Because the station isn't built on stability or consistency, but on constant adjustment between personalities that never fully align, and Dave, watching everything return to normal, finally stops trying to interpret it as a system that needs correction and instead accepts it as an environment that only works because it refuses to stay still, and that quiet acceptance is what closes the episode, not with resolution in the traditional sense, but with a return to controlled chaos that feels slightly more understood than before, even if nobody can fully explain why.